A black woman wrongly accused by a black police officer. Will anyone stand up to her, or will the system protect her once again? In a tense courtroom, the stakes are high and justice is at stake. Can one woman make a difference? Watch to find out. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories. The Atlanta District Court was filled with an anxious energy as the case of police brutality against Officer Charles Foster was about to unfold. Reporters, armed with their pens and notepads, scribbled furiously, capturing every detail of the moment. The back rows were packed with members of the local community, each face etched with hope and expectation. Families of victims who had suffered similar injustices sat together, offering silent prayers for the outcome of the trial. The room buzzed with whispers, but it was clear that everyone in attendance shared a singular wish: justice. In the center of the courtroom, seated behind the bench, was Judge Victoria Harris. At 40 years old, she was a seasoned, no-nonsense figure, widely respected for her balanced and fair judgments. She had spent over a decade on the bench, handling everything from minor disputes to complex criminal cases. Her reputation as a strong, decisive judge had earned her the respect of both her colleagues and the public. But today's case would be different. It wasn't just another trial. It was a battle for justice in a system that had long allowed those in power to avoid accountability. Her gaze swept the room briefly, taking in the crowd, the lawyers, the defendant, and the victim's family. She knew the weight of what was about to happen. Officer Foster was no stranger to the court. His history was long, filled with accusations of excessive force and racial profiling. Over the years, he had earned a reputation for being untouchable. Time and time again, the system had failed to hold him accountable. Today, that would change. The case against Foster was clear-cut. Video footage, witness testimony, and the victim himself, Malik Johnson, whose life had been irrevocably changed by Foster's actions. Malik was a 22-year-old man who had been stopped by Foster during a routine traffic check. The video had captured everything, showing Foster slamming Malik to the ground, striking him repeatedly after he had already complied with commands. The footage was disturbing, and there was no question about what had happened. Judge Harris flipped through the case file, her mind focused. Foster had been accused before, but this time, the evidence was irrefutable. The public was watching, and the pressure on her to deliver a fair and just verdict was immense. She could feel the weight of the community's expectations bearing down on her shoulders, but she didn't falter. She had built her career on the belief that the law should be blind to power, wealth, and status. As the courtroom settled, Judge Harris looked directly at Officer Foster, who sat with his arms crossed, his face impassive, almost smug. He had been in many courtrooms, and his posture suggested he was confident that his badge would shield him once again. But Judge Harris wasn't intimidated. She had dealt with men like him before, men who thought the law didn't apply to them. She took a breath and straightened in her chair. This was her moment. "Let's begin," she said, her voice steady and commanding. The trial was now in motion. The courtroom door swung open with a creak and Officer Charles Foster walked in. His uniform was immaculate, every crease sharp, every button perfectly in place, but his expression was far from respectful. He sauntered into the room with the air of a man who was used to getting what he wanted. His eyes swept the courtroom with a cold indifference, as if he were above everyone in the room. He took his time, deliberately arriving late, making sure that all eyes were on him as he made his entrance. It was his way of asserting dominance, of making everyone aware of his position, his power, and his invulnerability. Foster moved to the defense table with a deliberate calmness, his posture straight, and his steps measured. There was no remorse in his eyes, only a simmering arrogance. He was used to the system protecting him, used to walking out of courtrooms untouched, no matter how many complaints had been filed against him. He had been shielded by his badge for years, and today, despite the serious charges against him, he believed that the same system would once again bend to his will. Judge Victoria Harris, seated behind the bench, didn't flinch. She had dealt with men like Foster before, men who thought that the badge they wore could exempt them from the consequences of their actions. She had seen officers who walked into courtrooms as though they owned the place, convinced that the law didn't apply to them. But she wasn't intimidated. The eyes of the public were on her, and she wasn't about to let Foster's arrogance disrupt the proceedings. "Officer Foster," she said, her voice calm but firm, "I trust you understand the gravity of this situation." Her gaze never left him, and though her words were measured, there was no mistaking the authority behind them. Foster barely acknowledged her, nodding dismissively as he adjusted his tie. He sat down without looking at the victim's family, without acknowledging the community members who had come to watch the trial. His attitude reeked of entitlement. Judge Harris took a deep breath and straightened in her chair, never letting the disrespect rattle her. She turned to the prosecution, signaling for the proceedings to continue. She was in control of this courtroom, and Foster's theatrics would not sway her. The trial began, and the evidence against Officer Foster quickly started to mount. The prosecution's first witness was the video footage from a body camera worn by another officer on the scene. The grainy footage was hard to watch, but it left no room for doubt. The camera had captured everything. Malik Johnson, the victim, had been walking down the street, minding his own business when Officer Foster approached him. Without provocation, Foster had slammed Malik to the ground. The video showed Malik's hands in the air, his body on the pavement, pleading for Foster to stop as the officer rained down blows. Foster had been aggressive, using excessive force to subdue someone who was already complying with his orders. The victim's face was bruised, his shirt torn, his body broken from the violent treatment he had received. As the video played in the courtroom, the silence was palpable. The victim's family, sitting in the back row, gripped each other's hands tightly. Malik's mother wiped away a tear, her eyes fixed on the screen. The community members present exchanged quiet murmurs, but there was no denying the horror of what they were seeing. Next came the testimonies from witnesses who had seen the entire incident unfold. One man, a passerby who had been walking his dog when he witnessed the arrest, described what he had seen. "I saw the officer push the young man to the ground. It didn't look right. The man wasn't resisting. He was just standing there, and then the officer just attacked him." The courtroom was still, every person hanging on to the words being spoken. The victim's family exchanged glances of disbelief, but Malik Johnson's testimony was the most heartbreaking of all. When it was his turn to speak, Malik stood slowly, his hands trembling slightly as he took the stand. At 22 years old, he was young, but the trauma he had endured made him seem much older. His voice cracked as he began to recount the events of that fateful night. "I was walking home," he began, his voice low but steady. "It was late. I've walked down that street 100 times before. I heard the sirens, then the voice stopped right there, so I stopped. I didn't run, didn't argue, I just stood there with my hands up." He paused for a moment, clearly reliving the horror of the moment. "He told me to get on my knees, and I did. But then he charged at me. I didn't know what to do, I didn't fight back, I couldn't. But he slammed me to the ground, hit me again and again. Even when I stopped moving, he just kept hitting me." The room was silent as Malik spoke, his words heavy with the weight of the violence he had endured. The emotional pain was raw, but what was even more painful was the truth in his words. He had done nothing to provoke Officer Foster, yet he had been treated like a criminal. Foster, sitting at the defense table, remained unmoved by the testimony. His face was impassive, his arms folded across his chest, his eyes never leaving Malik. It was clear that he didn't believe he had done anything wrong. His continued defiance was evident in the way he sat back like he was above it all. The video, the witness testimonies, Malik's own harrowing account, none of it seemed to shake him. But Judge Harris was unfazed. She had seen men like Foster before, those who believed they were untouchable, immune to the consequences of their actions. And though Foster remained smug, Judge Harris didn't let his attitude derail the case. She wouldn't let his defiance cloud the truth. "Officer Foster," she said, her voice cutting through the stillness of the room, "do you have anything to say in your defense?" Foster leaned back in his chair, his lips curling into a faint smile. "No, Your Honor," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Just listening." Judge Harris clenched her jaw but didn't let her anger show. She had come this far and she would see this through to the end. Foster's defiance would not shake her resolve. She would make sure that the law applied equally to all, no exceptions, no matter the badge they wore. The courtroom was thick with tension as Officer Charles Foster sat at the defense table, his eyes scanning the room. The trial had reached a critical juncture. Foster's defiance was still evident, even as the overwhelming evidence against him mounted. He had walked into this courtroom with the certainty that his badge would shield him from responsibility, just as it had so many times before. But despite the damning video footage, the witness testimonies, and Malik Johnson's emotional testimony, Foster remained resolute. He had spent years believing he was above the law, and today, he was banking on the system protecting him once again. As the trial approached its peak, the room felt like it was holding its breath. The prosecution had made its case, presenting the video that captured the brutality of Foster's actions, as well as witness accounts that confirmed the unnecessary violence. Malik Johnson had given his powerful testimony, recounting the horrific experience of being assaulted by the officer. But Foster remained smug, his arrogance unshaken. Then, in an unexpected turn of events, the door to the courtroom creaked open. A murmur spread through the crowd as two FBI agents walked in, their presence immediately commanding attention. They were sharply dressed, their faces serious, and they carried an air of authority that shifted the atmosphere in the room. Everyone in the courtroom paused, unsure of what was happening. This was not normal procedure. The defense lawyer, Russell Keegan, immediately stood, his voice rising in protest. "Your Honor, what is this? This is highly irregular." Judge Victoria Harris, unfazed by the sudden interruption, turned her steady gaze toward the agents. "What is the meaning of this?" she asked, her voice calm but authoritative. One of the agents stepped forward, his eyes fixed on the judge. "Your Honor, we have a significant announcement regarding Officer Charles Foster. The FBI has been investigating his actions for several years, and we have just filed a federal indictment against him for abuse of power, misconduct, and violations of civil rights in multiple incidents." A stunned silence fell over the courtroom. Foster's face went pale. For the first time in the trial, his bravado faltered. His jaw clenched and his eyes darted nervously around the room. This was not what he had expected. The realization that his carefully constructed world was beginning to collapse hit him like a ton of bricks. The system that had always protected him was suddenly being ripped apart. The agent continued. "The FBI investigation has uncovered systemic corruption and a pattern of abuse within the police department. Officer Foster's actions have been covered up for years, but with this new evidence, his immunity is no longer valid. He will now be held accountable for his actions." Foster remained motionless, his hands clenched tightly into fists. He had never imagined a day when his badge wouldn't protect him. He had been untouchable for so long, and now it felt as though the ground was shifting beneath his feet. His eyes met Judge Harris's for the first time during this revelation, and for the first time there was something in them that wasn't defiance, but fear. Judge Harris remained calm, her expression unreadable. She had been waiting for this moment. She had always known that the law would catch up with Foster, no matter how long it took. She took a slow breath, then addressed the court with a sense of finality. "Officer Foster, you have been indicted for your actions. The evidence presented is clear, and the time for you to avoid accountability has passed. You are hereby ordered into federal custody." The room remained silent for a beat, but the weight of the moment hung heavy in the air. Foster's face twisted with disbelief. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came out. His entire demeanor shifted in an instant, and for the first time, he was a man who realized he was not above the law. The FBI agents moved swiftly. Without hesitation, they stepped toward Foster, and the room seemed to hold its breath as one of the agents reached for a pair of handcuffs. Foster didn't resist, but his body seemed rigid, as if he couldn't fully comprehend what was happening to him. The agent snapped the cuffs around his wrists, and the noise echoed in the otherwise still room. The sight of Officer Foster being led out of the courtroom in handcuffs was a sight no one would forget. The man who had terrorized countless individuals for years, who had stood in this very room mocking the process of justice, was now a criminal, facing the consequences of his actions. Judge Harris looked on, her face a picture of determination. She had known from the start that the path to justice would not be easy. But today, the system had worked. Foster had been held accountable, and no one, no matter their power or position, could escape the reach of the law. As the agents escorted Foster from the room, a murmur of relief swept through the gallery. It was a victory, not just for Malik Johnson, but for everyone who had ever suffered under the weight of an unjust system. The silence that followed was deafening, but it was the kind of silence that marked a new beginning. Judge Harris sat back in her chair, her gaze unwavering. The case was far from over, but today, justice had been served. The courtroom, still and heavy with anticipation, stood in stark contrast to the rush of emotions that coursed through it. Officer Charles Foster, for the first time in his career, was facing the legal consequences of his actions. The FBI agents, having carefully placed him in handcuffs, began to escort him out of the courtroom. The officer who had once walked in with an air of invincibility was now a mere figure of defeat. His smugness had vanished entirely, replaced by a look of shock and disbelief. It was the first time he had ever truly felt the weight of the law upon him. For years, Foster had evaded accountability, using his badge as a shield to protect him from the fallout of his actions. His reputation among the community was one of intimidation and fear. His ability to skirt justice had made him untouchable in their eyes. But now, as the handcuffs clicked into place, the dramatic reversal of roles was undeniable. Officer Foster, once a figure of unchecked authority, was now being led away in a stark reminder of the law's power to hold everyone accountable, no matter their position. As the agents led him through the door, the silence that followed was broken only by quiet sobs and whispers. The victim's family, especially Malik Johnson's mother, sat in the back, their faces full of quiet relief. For Malik's family, this moment was monumental. They had been waiting for justice, for a moment like this when they could see the system do what it was meant to do, hold the guilty accountable. The constant fear, the doubt, the years of wondering if anyone would ever listen, those burdens had been lifted, even if just for a moment. Malik's mother looked at her son, who sat beside her, his face tired but hopeful. She wiped away a tear and squeezed his hand. The long road to this moment had been fraught with pain, but today they had witnessed something rare, something that felt like a victory not only for their family but for the community as a whole. The truth had finally come to light, and the guilty officer had been held accountable. The courtroom, which had been so tense and heavy just moments before, now held a sense of peace. Judge Victoria Harris sat silently at the bench, her expression calm but intense. She had remained steady throughout the trial, not allowing the pressure of the case or Foster's defiant behavior to sway her. She had not been intimidated by the status Foster held, nor the systemic forces that had tried to shield him. Today, Judge Harris had made sure that the law was upheld, not just for the victim but for the entire community watching, waiting for justice. She had proved that no one, no matter their position or power, was above the law. Her actions had spoken volumes. Judge Harris was more than just a judge in that courtroom. She was a beacon of resilience and fairness. She had dedicated her career to making sure justice was not influenced by wealth or status, and her unwavering commitment to the truth had brought the case to a powerful conclusion. The victory in this case was not just about the legal outcome, but about showing that integrity could and would triumph over corruption. As the room began to empty, the reality of what had just transpired began to settle in. For Malik Johnson's family, the relief was palpable. The oppressive weight of years of systemic injustice, of unpunished violence, had been lifted. The room was filled with a shared sense of vindication. But for Judge Harris, the victory, though meaningful, was just one step in a much larger battle. The fight for real systemic change was far from over. Today, justice had been served, but the struggle for equality and accountability would continue. The story of Foster's downfall was a stark reminder of the need for reform within the justice system. The victory in this courtroom, small as it might seem in the face of the larger problems, sent a powerful message. No one, no matter their position or power, should ever be above the law. And as the doors of the courtroom closed, the lesson lingered: accountability was essential, and change was possible.